Picture this: a flickering candle casts eerie shadows across a stone chamber, where glass vials bubble with mysterious liquids and parchment scrolls bear symbols no ordinary scholar could decipher. This was the world of medieval alchemists, but their story goes far beyond the cliché of gold-seeking mystics. Behind closed doors, these enigmatic figures were quietly shaping the fate of kingdoms, brokering secret alliances that would ripple through history. What if I told you that some of the most pivotal diplomatic breakthroughs of the Middle Ages didn't happen in grand courts or on battlefields, but in these very laboratories? Alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was a language of power, a hidden network where science and politics collided. Kings and popes sought out these masters of transformation, not just for their elusive formulas, but for their ability to navigate the murky waters of international intrigue. Think about it. Who better to mediate between warring factions than someone who could speak the universal dialect of symbols, herbs, and celestial charts? These alchemists became the unsung diplomats of their time, forging bonds between rivals who would never have trusted each other otherwise. Their laboratories doubled as clandestine meeting rooms, where treaties were whispered over alembics and alliances sealed with the exchange of a rare elixir. So why does this matter to us today? Because the legacy of these candlelit negotiations lives on in ways we rarely acknowledge. Modern diplomacy, with its backroom deals and scientific collaborations, owes more to these medieval intermediaries than we might think. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel how alchemists turned their art into a tool of statecraft, how their knowledge became a currency of trust, and why their shadowy alliances still echo in the way nations talk and sometimes betray each other. This isn't just a tale of the past, it's a lens to understand the hidden threads that connect science, power, and human ambition, ready to step into the laboratory. Let's begin. To understand how alchemists wore two hats, both scholar and spy, we need to step into their world where knowledge was power and power demanded secrecy. Imagine a royal court in the 14th century. While knights jostled for favor and bishops whispered in corridors, the alchemist moved differently. Their value lay not in swords or sermons, but in something far more potent: mastery over the unseen. Whether distilling medicines that could save a monarch's life or crafting inks that vanished unless exposed to candlelight, these practitioners held skills that rulers couldn't ignore. Take the case of Ramon Lule, a philosopher-alchemist who served the Aragonese crown. Officially, he was deciphering the secrets of transmutation. Unofficially, his travels across North Africa and the Middle East were a cover for gathering intelligence on rival powers. His notebooks, filled with coded symbols, doubled as diplomatic dispatches. This wasn't unusual. Many alchemists carried sealed letters disguised as recipes, their laboratories stocked with dual-purpose tools, a mortar and pestle for grinding herbs, yes, but also for crushing wax seals to intercept messages. The line between science and espionage blurred further when alchemists turned their craft into a language of trust. A ruler might distrust a foreign ambassador, but a shared fascination with alchemy could bridge divides. When the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II wanted to negotiate with the Sultan of Egypt, he didn't send a soldier or a priest. He sent an alchemist bearing gifts of rare salts and celestial maps. These exchanges weren't just about chemistry, they were diplomatic rituals, a way to say, we speak the same hidden language, yet this duality came with peril. One misstep, a poorly phrased formula, a too curious apprentice could unmask an alchemist's true role. Some, like the infamous Gilles de Rais, paid the ultimate price when their political maneuvers overshadowed their scientific reputations. Others thrived precisely because their art demanded ambiguity. In an age where kings and popes alike sought control over nature's secrets, the alchemists' ability to navigate both the visible and invisible worlds made them indispensable. Their laboratories weren't just workshops, they were theaters of influence where every bubbling flask and cryptic scroll could tip the scales of power. The flickering glow of candlelight in an alchemist's laboratory did more than illuminate dusty tomes. It concealed the most delicate negotiations of the medieval world. Behind those heavy oak doors, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and lavender, power brokers from across kingdoms gathered under the guise of scholarly pursuit. A merchant might lean in to examine a flask of crimson liquid, while in reality, he was passing intelligence about Silk Road tariffs. A nobleman's interest in celestial charts could mask discussions of marriage alliances between warring houses. Even the tools of the trade played double duty. A mortar's rhythmic grinding could drown out whispers, while a carefully placed mirror reflected approaching footsteps. Consider the workshop of 14th-century alchemist Petrus Bonus in Bohemia, a crossroads for diplomats, spies, and theologians. His famed Book of the Pearl wasn't merely a treatise on transmutation. Its illustrations of serpents swallowing their tails hid coded maps of disputed borderlands. Visitors came seeking elixirs but left with brokered truces. One particularly volatile meeting between Venetian and Genoese emissaries was diffused not by swords, but by Bonus demonstrating the chemical wedding, a symbolic fusion of opposites that mirrored the compromise they'd later sign. The laboratory's very chaos, its cluttered shelves and steaming retorts, created the perfect illusion of harmless eccentricity, allowing sensitive talks to unfold unnoticed. What made these spaces uniquely suited for diplomacy? Unlike castles bristling with guards or churches swarming with clerics, alchemical workshops operated on the fringes of society's gaze. Their owners were considered odd but harmless, their activities too obscure to arouse suspicion. A bishop might hesitate to meet a Muslim envoy in his cathedral, but in an alchemist's den. Here, under pretense of debating Aristotle's Elements, they could negotiate grain shipments during a siege. The laboratory's aura of mystery also lent weight to its role as neutral ground. When two rivals inhaled the same incense-laden air and touched the same gilded scales, it created unspoken bonds. Yet the greatest secret these walls kept wasn't political, it was psychological. The shared awe of witnessing mercury dance like liquid silver, or watching gold emerge from a crucible temporarily dissolved hierarchies. In that dim, enchanted space, a duke and a common merchant could stand shoulder to shoulder, united by wonder. That fleeting equality often paved the way for agreements impossible in sunlit courts. When the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV needed to placate rebellious Saxon lords, his court alchemists staged a spectacle of turning base metal into gold, a metaphor for transforming discord into unity that resonated deeper than any speech. The legacy of these candlelit dealings lingers in modern diplomacy's DNA. Today's back-channel negotiations in university labs or tech incubators owe much to their medieval predecessors. Both eras understood that true breakthroughs often happen away from podiums and treaties, in spaces where the boundaries between science, art, and statecraft blur. The next time you see a flickering candle, remember, 6 centuries ago, that same trembling light might have witnessed the birth of an alliance that changed the course of history. In the fractured political landscape of medieval Europe, where dialects changed every few miles and trust was scarcer than gold, alchemy offered something revolutionary, a silent tongue that required no translation. Picture a Hungarian nobleman and an Ottoman vizier seated across from each other, their spoken languages mutually incomprehensible. Yet when the alchemist between them unrolled a scroll bearing the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, both men nodded. That single symbol spoke volumes, cycles of destruction and renewal, the inevitability of change, the possibility of reconciliation. Such was the power of alchemical imagery, a visual Esperanto for the elite. The genius of this system lay in its layers of meaning. Take the symbol for Mercury, often drawn as a caduceus. To a novice, it might represent a metallic element. But to initiated diplomats, it could signal neutrality. Mercury's ability to alloy with most metals made it the perfect emblem for mediation. When the Duke of Burgundy sent a flask labeled with this symbol to the Swiss Confederacy during tense border disputes, it wasn't a chemical gift. It was an invitation to negotiate, wrapped in the plausible deniability of scholarly exchange. Rituals deepened this coded dialogue. The meticulous process of distillation separating pure from impure became political theater. In 1483, as tensions flared between Naples and Aragon, their respective alchemists staged a joint purification of antimony before observers. The public marveled at the spectacle, while courtiers recognized the subtext, two rival courts demonstrating their capacity to refine discord into cooperation. Even failures held meaning. A collapsed alembic during Franco-Flemish talks wasn't just an accident. It became an omen prompting both sides to soften their demands. This symbolic language flourished precisely because it operated in plain sight. Unlike ciphers that aroused suspicion, alchemical manuscripts circulated openly in royal libraries. A treatise on the green lion devouring the sun might seem like mystical nonsense to a soldier, but to a Florentine banker, it could indicate upcoming currency devaluations in Lyon. The Church, usually wary of unorthodox knowledge, tolerated these practices because many symbols overlapped with Christian iconography. The pelican piercing its breast to feed its young with blood doubled as both a distillation apparatus and a metaphor for Christ's sacrifice. Yet the system's true brilliance was its fluidity. Symbols shifted meaning contextually, allowing a single drawing to convey different messages to different viewers. The phoenix rising from ashes might promise military resurgence to one ruler while assuring another of trade route restoration after a plague. Such ambiguity let alchemists walk a razor's edge, appearing loyal to all while serving none exclusively. When the English alchemist George Ripley sent identical lunar diagrams to both Yorkist and Lancastrian factions during the Wars of the Roses, each side interpreted it as secret support, buying him protection from both camps. The decline of this visual diplomacy came not from exposure, but from the rise of printed texts that standardized symbols' meanings. What once was fluid became fixed, stripping alchemy of its most potent diplomatic tool. Yet traces remain. Modern negotiators still employ symbolic gestures, whether exchanging pens at treaty signings or choosing neutral venues like Geneva's Palace of Nations. The next time you see two leaders shake hands before a fluttering flag, remember, they're speaking a language forged centuries ago in candlelit chambers, where the real magic wasn't turning lead into gold, but enemies into allies. Among the most intriguing shadows flickering through alchemical history moves the Rosicrucian Order, less a brotherhood than a ghost, appearing and vanishing across 17th century Europe like quicksilver. Their three manifestos, published between 1614 and 1616, claimed the existence of an invisible college of enlightened adepts. But read between the lines of those florid texts, with their promises of universal reformation and their intricate engravings of rose-cross emblems, and you'll detect something startling: the blueprint of a pan-European intelligence network disguised as mystical scholarship. Consider the timing. The Rosicrucian Manifestos emerged during the powder keg of the 30 Years' War, when Protestant and Catholic states clashed over territory and theology. In this climate, a group claiming to transcend religious divisions while advocating secret wisdom could move freely where diplomats could not. The Fama Fraternitatis, their first public document, wasn't merely spiritual allegory, it functioned like a cipher. Descriptions of Christian Rosencreuz's fictional pilgrimage to Damascus and Fez mirrored actual routes used by Habsburg and Ottoman informants. The vault where Rosencreuz's body supposedly lay preserved for centuries. Historians now note its description matches underground chambers used by Venetian spies to store intercepted correspondence. The order's recruitment methods further blur the line between mysticism and espionage. Prospective members were instructed to signal their interest not by applying directly, but by publishing their own alchemical treatises, a brilliant filter that identified individuals with both scholarly credibility and access to printing presses, Europe's nascent information superhighway. When the physician Michael Mayer, alchemist to Emperor Rudolph II, began disseminating Rosicrucian symbols through his music compositions, he wasn't just composing melodies. His Atalanta Fugians encoded troop movements in Bohemia using planetary alignments that doubled as musical intervals. What makes the Rosicrucian enigma so compelling is how it weaponized ambiguity. Their texts overflow with deliberate contradictions, claims of being invisible while publishing openly, vows of poverty alongside descriptions of gold-making techniques. This wasn't carelessness, it was tradecraft. Like a hall of mirrors, the manifestos allowed different readers to see what they wanted. A Lutheran prince might interpret the General Reformation as endorsement of Protestant revolt, while a Catholic cardinal could read the same passage as allegory for spiritual renewal. The same flexibility let their couriers operate in plain sight. Apothecaries carrying rose-scented letters could be simple merchants or bearers of state secrets, their alchemical supplies perfect hiding places for folded vellum. The order's eventual disappearance only deepens the mystery. By 1620, references to the Rosicrucians vanish from official records, not because they dissolved, but because their methods evolved. Many scholars trace their legacy directly to early Masonic lodges, where similar symbolic communication persisted. Others note that key Rosicrucian figures like Johann Valentin Andry later emerged as peace negotiators during the Treaty of Westphalia, applying their cross-border networking skills to formal diplomacy. Perhaps the ultimate proof of their dual nature lies in how contemporaries reacted. While common folk debated whether the invisible brothers could truly turn base metals into gold, monarchs like James I of England issued proclamations denouncing them as seditious, a curious overreaction toward mere philosophers. Meanwhile, in Prague, Emperor Rudolph's spies intercepted letters between alchemists containing rosewater-stained fingerprints, a calling card now believed to mark priority messages. The Rosicrucians may have clothed themselves in mysticism, but the powers of their day responded as one does to a genuine threat, not with laughter but with surveillance. Their greatest alchemical feat wasn't transmuting lead into gold. It was transforming the very act of secret knowledge into a currency that bought influence across war-torn Europe. Paracelsus cut through 16th century Europe like a scalpel through rotten flesh, a man who dressed in a surgeon's blood-stained apron but moved with the cunning of a spy. Born Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, he shed his aristocratic name like a snake shedding skin, rebranding himself as Paracelsus, literally beyond Celsus, a declaration of war on the medical establishment. But his defiance wasn't confined to medicine. In an era where taking the wrong side in a feud could mean losing your head, This firebrand alchemist became the ultimate freelance diplomat, playing rival factions against each other with the same audacity he used to toss revered medical texts onto bonfires. His methods were as unorthodox as his prescriptions. While other envoys arrived with sealed letters and polished speeches, Paracelsus barged into tense negotiations clutching vials of foul-smelling tinctures, declaring he could heal not just bodies but the sickness of discord. In 1526, when peasant revolts threatened to engulf Salzburg, the city council didn't summon a priest or general, they summoned Paracelsus. His solution, a theatrical demonstration where he dissolved gold in aqua regia, then resurrected it before the rebels' eyes. As the phoenix rises from ashes, he thundered, "So shall this city from strife." The spectacle worked, not because the peasants believed in alchemy, but because they recognized a man who spoke their language of symbols and spectacle. What made Paracelsus uniquely dangerous was his refusal to be pigeonholed. To Protestant princes, he was the Catholic renegade who mocked papal indulgences. To bishops, he was the heretic who somehow knew which monasteries secretly stockpiled gunpowder. This very ambiguity became his diplomatic armor. When the Duke of Württemberg and Swiss reformers deadlocked over border disputes, Paracelsus didn't appeal to scripture or law. He brewed a universal elixir from local herbs, claiming it would balance humors as treaties balance powers. The act was pure theater, but by making both sides participate in the ritual, he created shared ground where none existed. Yet his greatest diplomatic coup came in Basel, where he leveraged a medical miracle into political capital. After saving the leg of a prominent printer from amputation, a feat that made him an overnight celebrity, he convinced the city council to let him lecture publicly. His real agenda, the lecture hall became a neutral zone where French and German merchants, normally at each other's throats over trade routes, could mingle under the pretense of scholarly curiosity. The contracts signed in those smoky back rows reshaped the Rhine's economy for decades. Paracelsus's end was as chaotic as his life. He died mysteriously in Salzburg at 47, possibly poisoned, his body buried in an unmarked grave to avoid desecration by enemies. But his legacy as the alchemist who turned volatility into a diplomatic weapon lived on. In an age where most mediators sought to smooth tensions, he understood that sometimes you had to burn away the infection to save the patient. His successors, those rare souls who dared to walk the knife's edge between science and statecraft, would whisper his name like a charm against conformity. For in a world of rigid alliances, there was power in being the one variable no equation could contain. Prague under Rudolf II wasn't just a royal capital, it was a stage where alchemy and statecraft performed an intricate dance. The Holy Roman Emperor's obsession with the occult is often painted as eccentricity, but look closer. His sprawling castle complex, crammed with astrolabes and grotesque automata, functioned as a diplomatic backchannel when Europe was tearing itself apart over religion. While Catholic and Protestant armies clashed outside city walls, inside Rudolf's galleries, Ottoman envoys and Jesuit scholars bent over the same alembics, their shared fascination with transmutation creating fragile bridges across ideological chasms. Take the case of the Persian ambassador Hussein Ali Beg, who arrived in Prague in 1590 with a retinue of Shiite mystics. Officially, his mission was to discuss trade routes. Yet court records show he spent more time in Rudolf's private laboratory than the audience chamber. Their exchanges weren't about spices or silk, they revolved around the Red Lion, a code name for a process to purify mercury. To outsiders, this was mere scholarly curiosity. In reality, mercury was Europe's most sought-after commodity, essential for refining silver from New World mines. By discussing it through alchemical metaphors, Rudolf and Ali Beg negotiated mining rights without triggering Habsburg Spain's suspicions. The emperor's most brilliant maneuver was institutionalizing this ambiguity. He established the Kunstkammer, a cabinet of wonders where every artifact served dual purposes. A celestial globe commissioned from the famed alchemist Tycho Brahe might display real star charts to astronomers, but its hidden compartments held cipher keys for communicating with Lutheran princes. Even the bizarre became strategic when Rudolf exhibited a mermaid skeleton, actually a monkey torso sewn to a fish tail. It wasn't mere spectacle. The creature symbolized the union of opposites, a not-so-subtle hint to visiting diplomats that incompatible realms could be forcibly, yet profitably, joined. Ottoman agents proved particularly receptive to this coded language. The Sultan's chief translator, Murad the Jew, regularly sent Rudolf alchemical texts with marginal notes in Ladino. To the uninitiated, these appeared to be commentary on distillation techniques. Deciphered, they contained troop dispositions along the Hungarian frontier. One surviving manuscript in Vienna's archives shows gold leaf rubbed thin at specific corners, likely used to test for poison, revealing how even paranoia became a shared dialect between rivals. Yet Prague's golden age of alchemical diplomacy couldn't last. When Rudolf's mental deterioration became undeniable, the fragile alliances woven in candlelight began unraveling. His brother Matthias, seizing power in 1611, dismissed the imperial alchemists as charlatans, but their legacy endured in unexpected ways. The Rosicrucian manifestos that appeared shortly after Rudolf's death recycled his court's symbolism, suggesting exiled adepts were repurposing their skills for new patrons. Meanwhile, the Kunstkammer's treasures were scattered across Europe, many landing in the hands of princes who'd witnessed their diplomatic utility firsthand. What made this moment unique wasn't just the fusion of science and politics. It was the realization that esoteric knowledge could create neutral territory in a world aflame with sectarian violence. In an era when mentioning the wrong saint could get you hanged, discussing the philosopher's stone offered safe passage through ideological minefields. The real transmutation wasn't lead into gold, but enemies into collaborators, if only for as long as the crucible glowed. The secret weapon of alchemist diplomats wasn't just their knowledge of obscure symbols, it was their ability to reframe failure as opportunity. Consider the disastrous summit between Poland and the Teutonic Knights in 1432, where both sides stormed out over territorial disputes. Enter Michael Sendivogius, a Polish alchemist who'd been quietly observing the chaos. Instead of chasing after the delegates, he announced he discovered a method to extract virgin silver from local mines, a substance both factions desperately needed for coinage. Overnight, the focus shifted from dividing land to sharing resources. His laboratory became neutral ground where knights and nobles haggled over ore samples instead of borders, and what began as a collapsed peace treaty morphed into a decade-long mining consortium. This alchemical sleight of hand worked because it tapped into a deeper truth. Conflict often stems from scarcity, whether of land, wealth, or trust. By introducing a new variable, some rare ingredient or technique, these scholar envoys could rewrite the entire equation. When Venetian and Ottoman forces deadlocked over control of Cyprus in 1570, the alchemist Giovanni da Udine didn't plead for compromise. He demonstrated how Cypriot earth could purify saltpeter, tripling gunpowder potency. Suddenly, both empires saw the island not as territory to conquer, but as a joint investment. The resulting Powder Pact held longer than any ceasefire because profit, unlike piety, was a language both sides understood. Their immunity as men of science granted unique freedoms. While priests and merchants faced searches at every border, alchemists traveled with trunks full of suspicious powders unchallenged. A flask labeled quicksilver might genuinely contain mercury for experiments or payroll silver for mercenaries. This ambiguity became their shield. Records from the Medici archives reveal how alchemist envoys used their workshops as clearinghouses. A Florentine agent would leave a coded message tucked between pages of an Arabic chemistry text, only for a Milanese counterpart to retrieve it days later under pretense of borrowing the volume. The real alchemy was turning every bookshelf and furnace into dead drops. Perhaps their most ingenious tactic was weaponizing patience. Modern diplomats race against clocks, but alchemists played the long game literally. The months-long process of creating a philosopher's stone provided perfect cover for protracted negotiations. When the Duke of Bavaria needed to stall Swedish demands during the 30 Years' War, his court alchemist Johann Joachim Becher announced a groundbreaking experiment requiring planetary alignment and 12 full moons. The Swedes, unwilling to appear unsophisticated, waited politely while Bavarian forces regrouped. By the time the experiment concluded, the balance of power had shifted. Yet their greatest legacy was psychological. These masters of transformation taught warring factions to see each other differently, not through the lens of old grievances, but through the promise of mutual gain. Like turning base metal into gold, they showed how perceived adversaries could become partners under the right conditions. That lesson still echoes today whenever negotiators sit down not to divide a pie, but to invent a new recipe together. The alchemical wedding wasn't merely a poetic metaphor. It was a masterclass in political theater, where the fusion of mercury and sulfur mirrored the joining of warring houses. Take the infamous 1476 union between the houses of York and Castile, brokered not by bishops or heralds, but by the alchemist Bernard of Treves. Faced with noble families who'd rather see their bloodlines end than mixed, Bernard staged an elaborate demonstration in Burgundy's Great Hall. As the nobles watched, he combined two liquids, one crimson as York's rose, the other golden as Castile's fields, into a single shimmering solution. "Behold," he declared, "what was divided is now inseparable, yet neither loses its essence." The symbolism was unmistakable, unity without surrender. Within months, the reluctant wedding contracts were signed, sealed with Bernard's own wax stamped with a phoenix rising from a crucible. This alchemical framing worked because it transformed political necessity into cosmic destiny. When Maximilian I sought to unite Habsburg Austria with Burgundy's rebellious territories, his court alchemist crafted a ceremonial flask with two necks converging into one, a visual echo of the marital chalice used in weddings. By having representatives from both lands pour their local wines into the vessel, the act became more than a toast. It was alchemy in action, turning the base metal of distrust into the gold of shared interest. Even the resulting blend's slight cloudiness played into the narrative. The alchemist claimed it symbolized the necessary impurities that give strength to alloys, just as minor cultural differences would strengthen the union. The ritual's power lay in their mutability. The same allegory could serve opposite ends. In 1521, when the Medici needed to distance themselves from a compromised French alliance, their resident alchemist performed a separation ceremony before Florentine dignitaries. Heating a mixture representing the two states, he carefully distilled off the lighter French fraction, leaving behind pure Florentine essence, the message. Some bonds, like volatile spirits, were meant to be temporary. The performance gave the political divorce an air of natural inevitability, sparing both sides public humiliation. Yet these symbolic acts carried real geopolitical weight. The infamous silver wedding between Poland and Lithuania in 1585 was preceded by months of alchemical pageantry. Envoys exchanged vials of soil Poland's rich black earth, Lithuania's sandy loam, which court alchemists married in a public synthesis. The resulting compound was sealed in a crystal orb displayed at the actual wedding, a tangible promise that the union would yield something greater than its parts. Decades later, when separatists threatened the partnership, elders would point to that orb, its contents still visibly layered yet inseparable, as living proof of their shared destiny. What modern observers often miss is how these ceremonies leveraged alchemy's most subversive quality, its defiance of categories. Just as alchemists claimed their art was neither fully science nor magic, these diplomatic weddings occupied a liminal space between sacrament and strategy. A bishop might bless the marriage, but it was the alchemist's crucible that made it palatable to nobles who'd never kneel at the same altar. The genius was in the dual reading. Pious onlookers saw divine harmony, while pragmatists recognized a calculated play for resources. In an age where bloodlines were fortunes and alliances were survival, the alchemical wedding became the ultimate sleight of hand, transforming the lead of grudges into the gold of concord, one symbolic fusion at a time. John Dee's library at Mortlake wasn't just a collection of books, it was a nerve center of Elizabethan power, where star charts rubbed shoulders with cipher keys and globes hid compartments for intercepted letters. Officially, Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer, unofficially her most unconventional spymaster, Dee wielded alchemy not just as a science, but as a cover for operations that stretched from Moscow to Prague. His famous 007 symbol, two eyes topped by a crescent, resembling spectacles, wasn't just a personal sigil. When scribbled in the margins of his grimoires, it signaled messages intended for the Queen's eyes only, earning him the nickname, the original 007, centuries before Ian Fleming's creation. Dee's genius lay in turning mysticism into geopolitical leverage. When England needed to counter Spanish dominance in the New World, he didn't send soldiers. He sent treatises on monadic mathematics, dense with alchemical diagrams that concealed maps of Spanish shipping routes. His 6-year mission to Central Europe, ostensibly to study with fellow alchemists, was really an intelligence-gathering tour. In Bohemia, he demonstrated the philosopher's stone to Emperor Rudolf II's court, while discreetly assessing Habsburg military ambitions. In Poland, his lectures on angelic communication masked meetings with Baltic grain merchants, whose cooperation could break England's reliance on Catholic suppliers. The tools of his trade were as ingenious as his missions. A scrying mirror made of polished obsidian, now displayed in the British Museum, likely doubled as a cipher device, its reflective surface perfect for encoding messages when angled to candlelight. His celestial navigational charts, filled with cryptic annotations, didn't just guide sailors, they pinpointed vulnerable ports for privateer attacks. Even his infamous Enochian language, supposedly dictated by angels, functioned as an unbreakable diplomatic code. When Mary, Queen of Scots, was caught plotting against Elizabeth, investigators found letters referencing the seventh ether, a phrase lifted directly from Dee's angelic lexicon, revealing her network had been compromised for years. Yet Dee's greatest alchemy was transforming England's global standing. His manuscript, Britanniae Imperii Limites, didn't just argue for British naval expansion. It reimagined the entire Atlantic as an alchemical crucible, where base colonies could be transmuted into sources of imperial power. His advocacy for a British Empire, a term he popularized, framed colonization as cosmic destiny, with Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, whose rule mirrored the alchemical virgin's purification of matter. This wasn't mere poetry, it was ideological alchemy, turning the lead of England's peripheral status into the gold of imperial ambition. The tragic irony. Dee died in poverty, his reputation tarnished by the very secrecy that made him invaluable. While later centuries dismissed him as a deluded mystic, modern decrypted archives reveal the truth. His angels were metaphors, his crystals were tools, and his real magic was making the invisible hand of the state move kingdoms. When James I, wary of occult associations, finally sidelined him, England lost more than an astrologer. It lost the man who'd turned the language of the stars into the grammar of empire. The laboratory of a medieval alchemist smelled of more than sulfur and vinegar. It carried the metallic tang of paranoia. Every distillation, every tincture could mean the difference between a treaty's success and a diplomat's sudden, writhing demise. Take the case of Alessandro Cagliostro, an Italian alchemist serving the Duke of Ferrara in the late 1500s. When rival factions sought to disrupt peace talks with Venice, they didn't send assassins with daggers. They gifted the Duke a lavishly bound herbal compendium, its pages laced with enough aconite to kill a dozen men. Cagliostro, noticing the peculiar sheen on the vellum, dunked a corner in wine and watched the liquid turn violet. His swift antidote of milk thistle and crushed emerald saved the Duke's life and salvaged the negotiations. This was the poisoner's paradox. The very substances that made alchemists targets also made them untouchable. A ruler might plot against a bothersome scribe or general, but who would eliminate the only person who could detect arsenic in their wine? The Habsburg court physician Paracelsus famously survived 3 poisoning attempts precisely because he'd spent years mapping how different metals reacted to toxins. His Toxicorum Codex wasn't just medical research, it was a survival manual, detailing how silver spoons tarnished in the presence of liverwort extract, or how mercury would clot abnormally when mixed with certain venoms. The most powerful alchemist diplomats turned their vulnerability into theater. Before tasting any drink offered during negotiations, the French envoy Nicolas Flamel would dramatically drop a truth pearl, a bead of distilled moonstone, into the cup. If it dissolved, the liquid was safe. If it blackened, the host's treachery stood exposed. The ritual served dual purposes. It tested for poison while broadcasting that the alchemist's knowledge made assassination attempts futile. Some took this further, like the Polish adept Sendivogius, who carried a ring set with a hollow crystal containing universal antidote. When offered suspicious fare, he'd stir it with the ring, letting observers see the liquid change color, a psychological deterrent as potent as the remedy itself. Yet the true mastery lay in selective vulnerability. Smart alchemists allowed minor poisonings to succeed occasionally, just enough to remind patrons of their mortality. When the Medici alchemist Cosimo Ruggeri developed a slow-acting counteragent to wolfsbane, he let himself exhibit mild symptoms after dining with a suspect envoy. The calculated illness preserved his usefulness while warning the plotters. He could survive their worst but chose to let them live. This delicate dance reached its zenith in Moscow's Kremlin, where Ivan the Terrible kept an entire wing of alchemists prisoner, not to execute them, but to monopolize their antidote expertise. The Tsar's infamous oprichniki death squads feared these shackled savants, knowing the alchemists could just as easily poison their gruel as protect it. Ivan understood what every medieval power broker eventually learned. In a world where a feasting hall's salt cellar might conceal death, the person who controlled the cure held more influence than the one who wielded the sword. The laboratory's true transmutation wasn't lead into gold, it was fear into power, one carefully crafted antidote at a time. Deep in the vaulted caravanserais of the Silk Road, where merchants haggled over bolts of damask and jars of saffron, a more clandestine trade flourished, one measured not in gold ducats, but in drops of quicksilver and lines of cipher. Alchemists traveled these routes under the guise of scholarly pilgrimage. their saddlebags heavy with manuscripts that promised the secrets of lapis lazuli synthesis or eternal youth. But unroll those parchments under candlelight at certain angles, and invisible ink would bloom into maps of Mongol troop encampments or lists of defecting Byzantine officers. A recipe for dragon's blood resin might specify temperatures curiously matching the moon phases when Persian ships would be vulnerable in the Caspian. Consider the case of the Kitab al-Asrar, or Book of Secrets, carried by an alchemist named Yusuf ibn Mansur from Samarkand to Cairo in 1384. To the Mamluk Sultan's court chemists, it appeared to detail methods for purifying naphtha, but when the pages were brushed with a solution of fermented pomegranate rind, a technique known only to initiates, the margins revealed the exact locations where Ottoman sappers had weakened Constantinople's land walls. This intelligence would later prove crucial when the Mamluks diverted Venetian engineers to reinforce those very sections, delaying the city's fall by decades. The system's brilliance lay in its deniability. Unlike traditional spies caught with coded letters, an alchemist could always claim their suspicious texts were merely theoretical. When the Chinese alchemist Lai Xiaochun was apprehended near Antioch with scrolls detailing celestial correspondences, his captors found nothing incriminating until a savvy Byzantine general noticed the star charts corresponded not to heavenly bodies, but to the nightly patrol routes of Seljuk border garrisons. Even then, Lai avoided execution by demonstrating how the same charts could legitimately guide Mercury sublimation. The line between treason and scholarship was deliberately blurred. Transporting volatile substances provided perfect cover for moving sensitive information. A shipment of saltpeter destined for Damascus might contain hollow stirring rods packed with silk scrolls listing Hungarian mercenary prices. The Venetian Council of Ten famously used alchemical supply chains to track Spanish silver shipments from the New World, disguising their reports as notes on ore purification. A single symbol like the crow's foot notation for iron vitriol could indicate whether a galleon's cargo was being offloaded in Seville or secretly diverted to Antwerp. Perhaps the most consequential exchange happened in 1492, when a Jewish alchemist fleeing Portugal's Inquisition sold Granada's emir a tincture of solar essence. The formula itself was worthless, but the wax seal securing its vial bore the fingerprint of a naval officer who'd later defect, bringing knowledge of Portuguese caravel designs that would revolutionize North African shipbuilding. This pattern repeated across continents. Alchemical failures were often smokescreens for transferring practical knowledge. When Russian agents sought Swedish cannon-making techniques, they didn't bribe gunsmiths, they commissioned an alchemical study of iron alloys from a Stockholm adept who just happened to include furnace designs as apparatus illustrations. The legacy of this shadow trade lingers in modern intelligence practices. Today's dead drops in public parks and encrypted files masquerading as corporate spreadsheets descend directly from those alchemists who turned every crucible and herb jar into a potential courier. The real philosopher's stone wasn't a substance, it was the realization that in the right hands, even the most mundane chemical recipe could transmute into geopolitical leverage. The flickering candle that had illuminated centuries of alchemical diplomacy didn't gutter out all at once, it was snuffed by 1,000 small betrayals of trust. By the late 17th century, the once unassailable reputation of alchemist diplomats began to crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. The same ambiguity that had made them invaluable now made them suspect. When Louis XIV's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, demanded proof of transmutation from a renowned alchemist, the man produced a single ingot of gold, only for court chemists to discover it was merely gold leaf wrapped around lead. The scandal reverberated across Europe, eroding faith in the entire profession. Rationalist thinkers like Voltaire seized on such failures, mocking alchemists as purveyors of smoke and mirrors in an age that increasingly worshipped reason. But the deeper shift was philosophical. The Enlightenment didn't just dismiss alchemy's mystical claims, it rejected the very idea that knowledge should be compartmentalized. Why rely on cryptic symbols when mathematical equations could express universal truths? When Isaac Newton, himself a clandestine alchemist, published his Principia Mathematica, he unwittingly signed the death warrant of the old order. His laws of motion described a clockwork universe, leaving no room for the alchemist's cherished mysteries. Kings who once sought elixirs now wanted cannons calibrated by calculus. Courts that had prized horoscopes demanded actuarial tables. The political landscape shifted just as dramatically. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 established modern diplomatic protocols, formal embassies, standardized treaties, clear chains of command. In this new world, there was no place for an intermediary who answered to neither church nor state. Alchemists' greatest strength, their independence, became their fatal flaw. Without institutional backing, they were vulnerable to accusations of espionage. The Habsburgs, once their greatest patrons, now expelled them as potential fifth columnists. In England, the newly formed Royal Society marginalized alchemical research as unfit for gentlemen of science. Some alchemists attempted reinvention. The notorious Count Saint-Germain recast himself as a financier, using his network of contacts to broker loans between warring nations. But without the alchemical mystique, he was just another middleman. Others, like the Italian Giuseppe Balsamo, doubled down on fraud, selling fake Egyptian initiation rites to gullible aristocrats until exposure destroyed what little credibility remained. A few retreated into outright charlatanism, like the German Johann Reichert, whose universal solvent dissolved everything except the trust of his patrons. Yet the most poignant fate befell the genuine scholars, men like Michael Mayer, who had navigated the 30 Years' War's chaos with coded herbal manuscripts, found their life's work rendered obsolete. The Rosicrucian manifestos that once stirred geopolitical currents were now dismissed as fairy tales. Laboratories that had hosted clandestine summits became curiosity cabinets for tourists. The final insult came when alchemical texts were literally scraped for gold parchments thought to contain auric secrets were boiled down, leaving only stained vats and broken promises. What sealed their fate wasn't just the rise of science, but the birth of transparency as a political virtue. Enlightenment philosophers argued that statecraft, like chemistry, should operate in the open. The idea that vital negotiations required candlelit obscurity now seemed archaic, even dangerous. When Benjamin Franklin conducted his electrical experiments before the French court, he did so in broad daylight, a deliberate contrast to the alchemist's shadowy theatrics. The message was clear: the future belonged to those who worked in the glare of reason, not the flicker of mystery. Yet something irreducible was lost in this transition. The alchemist diplomat's genius had been their ability to speak in layers, to let a symbol mean one thing to a king and another to a pope, bridging divides through deliberate ambiguity. In a world increasingly obsessed with binaries, true or false, friend or enemy, their art of productive confusion had no place. The last of their kind didn't so much disappear as dissolve, like a sublimating mercury, leaving behind only stains on parchment and whispers in castle corridors. Their greatest transmutation, in the end, was turning themselves into ghosts of a forgotten age. The glass towers of CERN and the sterile corridors of the International Space Station might seem worlds apart from smoky medieval laboratories, but the DNA of alchemical diplomacy pulses through their operations. When Russian cosmonauts and American astronauts shared data aboard the ISS despite terrestrial sanctions, or when Iranian and Israeli scientists collaborate on particle physics experiments, they're replicating a pattern forged centuries ago, using the neutrality of discovery as a shield against political storms. Like their alchemist predecessors, today's researchers often find that a shared obsession with cosmic rays or quantum states can dissolve borders faster than any treaty. Consider the ITER fusion reactor in France, where 35 nations pour billions into a single experimental device. The project's labyrinthine funding agreements and rotating leadership would feel familiar to Rudolf II's court alchemists. Just as medieval rulers tolerated rival chemists in shared workshops to access rare knowledge, modern superpowers tolerate ideological adversaries in the pursuit of clean energy. The reactor's very design, a donut-shaped tokamak where hydrogen isotopes fuse under extreme conditions, mirrors the alchemical Ouroboros, symbolizing infinite renewal through collaboration. Even the language of modern science diplomacy carries echoes of the past. When North Korean and South Korean biologists jointly studied the demilitarized zone's ecosystems, they published under the banner of peninsular biodiversity, a phrase as carefully constructed as any alchemical cipher, allowing both regimes to claim credit without conceding legitimacy. Similarly, the Pugwash conferences during the Cold War, where nuclear physicists from opposing blocs met under the guise of academic discussion, functioned much like those 15th-century alchemical symposia where Venetians and Ottomans debated metallurgy while secretly negotiating trade routes. The tools have changed, but the strategies remain strikingly similar. Where alchemists once used mercury distillation to mask troop movements, modern scientists employ machine learning projects to quietly share satellite imagery of climate disasters across hostile borders. A recent declassified memo revealed that during the Syrian civil war, Russian and U.S. geologists exchanged earthquake data through a Swiss-hosted server labeled Mineralogical Studies, proving that the old art of plausible deniability still thrives. Even the peer review process has become a kind of cryptographic system where critiques of a Pakistani physicist's paper on water purification might conceal feedback on sensitive dam projects. Perhaps the most telling continuity lies in how both systems leverage urgency. Just as medieval alchemists convinced warring lords that only their elixirs could stop plagues, modern climate scientists frame cooperation as existential. The Arctic Council, where nations with competing territorial claims jointly study melting ice caps, operates on the same principle that once guided alchemist mediators. When survival is at stake, even rivals must share the crucible. The real transmutation isn't turning lead into gold, it's turning mutual need into temporary trust, whether the currency is antimony isotopes or carbon sequestration data. Yet a crucial difference remains. Unlike their shadowy predecessors, today's scientist diplomats often work in the spotlight, publishing findings that scrutinize power rather than serve it anonymously. When virologists during the COVID pandemic formed international coalitions to bypass patent restrictions, they weren't just continuing the alchemists' tradition, they were reclaiming it for public good. The candlelit chambers may have given way to Zoom grids lit by LED screens, but the essential alchemy persists, the ability to transform the base metal of conflict into something far more precious, not gold this time, but glimpses of a world where knowledge outranks nationalism. From cryptic symbols to covert treaties, alchemists proved that diplomacy thrives in the shadows. Their laboratories were more than workshops. They were the birthplaces of alliances that shaped our world. The echoes of their methods linger in today's bacchanal negotiations, where scientific collaborations and cultural exchanges often paved the way for political breakthroughs. Think of the way rival nations share climate data despite frosty relations, or how space agencies cooperate while terrestrial tensions simmer. These modern parallels reveal a timeless truth. Sometimes, progress requires stepping outside traditional frameworks and finding common ground in shared curiosity. What made alchemists uniquely suited for this role wasn't just their knowledge, but their mindset. They saw potential where others saw impossibility, whether in transmuting metals or bridging ideological chasms. That same alchemical thinking could transform today's deadlocked debates. Imagine applying their knack for symbolic gestures to contemporary conflicts, a joint research initiative between adversaries, framed not as concession but as exploration. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, which suspended territorial claims for scientific cooperation, offers a glimpse of this approach in action. Like the alchemists' elixirs, it turned contention into something far more valuable: trust. Yet the real lesson lies in their willingness to operate in ambiguity. Modern diplomacy often demands binary outcomes: win or lose, ally or enemy. The alchemists remind us that the most enduring solutions emerge from the gray spaces between. Their laboratories weren't just neutral ground. They were liminal spaces where rigid identities could soften, if only for the duration of an experiment. In an era of polarized narratives, we might benefit from reviving such spaces, not literal workshops, but forums where opposing sides can engage with problems too complex for slogans or sound bites. The challenge now is to reclaim their spirit without replicating their secrecy. Transparency matters, but so does the recognition that some breakthroughs require privacy to germinate. The alchemists' greatest legacy isn't their symbols or elixirs. It's the proof that even the bitterest rivals can find common language when the stakes are high enough. As climate crises and pandemics redefine global priorities, their model of pragmatic idealism feels less like ancient history and more like a blueprint. The question isn't whether we'll need their kind of diplomacy again, but whether we're bold enough to embrace it. So tell me, where do you see room for a little modern alchemy in today's world? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation bubbling like a crucible of fresh ideas.